This conference will now be recorded.
All right, so John, I'm going to give you control. All right, you have the ball, sir.
All right, thank you very much, Joe. Some of you may know I've, well, let me see, let me just go ahead and have my camera ready to go with this. Many of you know I've probably done a DStar presentation or training once or twice in this, but I want to gear tonight's presentation and training a little different than I've done in the past, because we're in a unique time. And as many of you know, we've got a bunch of new people who are either getting into DStar for the first time, turning that feature on and that mode on in their radio for the first time. They've only operated their radio differently before in an analog mode. And so tonight, I want to help and not go through a lot of detail on the history of DStar, the basics of it. I'll only spend a little bit of time on that, but also try to give you as much information as I can tonight to be able to make the most of it and be effective, because half of our nets that we have on the Aries side are on DStar and the other half on HF. And I'll say that DStar is another tool in the toolbox. It's not appropriate for every situation, but we've been fortunate in Georgia that we have pretty much a statewide network on DStar and a reflector, which I'll explain more of, that allows us to link repeaters and coverage across the state. So with a bunch of new people in tonight, we hope we can provide some information that will really help you out in terms of operating this mode. First thing I want to do is talk a little bit about digital modes in general. Now, it doesn't make any difference whether we're talking DStar, whether we're talking DMR, System Fusion, P25, NXDN, any flavor of digital. They're going to operate in a very similar way. Most of us are used to FM. That's how we got started with our technician licenses in amateur radio. And if you look at the green curve, you'll note that as your signal strength decreases, the readability also decreases. You start getting more noise, more white noise, more static, etc., until you get down to a point where the signal and the modulation is basically unintelligible. Well, digital operates differently. You can decrease the signal strength, and as you start decreasing it, the audio quality stays the same, and I'll explain a little bit of why that is the case. But it will stay the same until it gets down to where it cannot faithfully recreate your voice again, because this is being transmitted as data. And so when the bit error rate gets so high, and you'll notice that's down where we're around that 20% place on the curve. Not sure we can see my cursor, but you would already be pretty noisy if this was an FM signal. And at that point, it cannot recreate your voice faithfully again, and it starts breaking up. It either mutes, or we get something in DStar we call R2D2, and you'll recognize the sound. Many of you have been on there. So it's kind of difficult to understand sometimes why you're getting R2D2, and really it may be because that your signal is so weak you're barely getting into the repeater or other device, and that's what's creating that signal, because you didn't have the warning that you were going down in signal strength. It was good, it was good, it was good, and then you started dropping out. Now let's talk a little bit about the basics of digital. Remember, you're converting analog voice, like on FM, you're converting it to data. So what you're actually sending over the air is data, ones and zeros. You can add actual data to that, such as text, keyboard, files, etc. You can add to that voice in DStar to produce a single data stream that contains both voice and data. Your radio is modulated as a data carrier. If you've ever listened to a digital signal of any kind, it's going to sound like a buzz or a hiss if you're listening to it on an FM radio. And DStar is just like that. It will sound like a buzz or a hiss sound if you're listening to it, the output of a digital repeater or another station operating in DStar mode. Now, an important thing to remember in most digital modes, the occupied bandwidth is determined by the data bit rate, meaning the more bits you put in there, it's going to occupy more space. Now, below what you see on the left side is a standard, what we call 5 kilohertz deviation signal. Now, an actual 5 kilohertz deviation signal actually occupies about 16 kilohertz of bandwidth in the spectrum. Why do we call it 5 when it's actually 16? And that's calculated for an FM signal. It's plus or minus 5 kilohertz. And then you add to that the highest modulating frequency, which is usually about 3 kilohertz, 2 times that. So we're adding 2 times 5, 10, 2 times 3, which is 6, and that equals about 16 kilohertz. So the FCC emission designator for a standard FM signal is 16 kilohertz wide. But what you'll find with most digital signals, and they vary in width, they're going to occupy a lot less spectrum on the dial. So where a typical DStar signal only occupies about 6.25 kilohertz, 6.25 kilohertz on the dial. So most of the digital modes occupy less than an FM, which makes it perform better, adjacent channel. If we did some frequency refarming, which I don't know whether that'll ever happen, but we could actually put more signals within the band. All right, let's switch over. We've talked about digital. Now let's talk about DStar. It's one of several digital voice modes that's used in amateur radio. It's an open standard, and it still amazes me to this day, 10 or 11 years after DStar was introduced, I hear people saying it's proprietary. It is not. It's probably one of the most openly published standards. It was developed originally in Japan by the JARL, which is kind of a combination of the FCC and ARRL if it were in this country. DStar was specifically designed for amateur radio, which means your call sign is actually sent over the air versus a radio ID, which you'll see services, digital services like DMR or P25, they're not call sign based, it's a radio ID, and the radio has to translate that to a call sign from a lookup table. So keep in mind, and we'll talk about this from a couple of points of view, your call sign is actually transmitted over the air every time you push the transmit button. You have DStar radios commercially available from both AUXCOMM and Kenwood. The most popular handhelds right now is the AUXCOMM ID51A and the Kenwood D74A. Two very good radios, and then there's mobiles out there that you can get as well. I mentioned earlier, DStar has the capability for doing voice and data at the same time. So you can have voice, and then you can have low-speed data going along with it, like packet speed data. All digital modes typically use a family of decoder chip, vocoder chips from a company called DVSI. It's the AMB family of vocoder chips. No matter which one you're using, it's from this family of chips. And that is used to convert speech to data and vice versa. That's the only proprietary piece of any of the digital radios out there, and it's maybe about $25 or less in the cost of a radio. Now, a lot of people will say DStar requires the internet. It does not. DStar works just like any radio signal. If you are working simplex between two stations, that's fine. You get the improved voice quality without the noise. You can work through a local repeater, a local DStar repeater. But then if you want to go beyond that and link repeaters together, you do require the internet to link them together, and that accomplishes that through some what we'll call conference bridges called reflectors. I'll go into that in more detail. Now, getting on the air with a DStar radio is actually very, very simple. You can go down to your favorite toy store and buy one, or have it shipped in next day, and you can be on the air in just a matter of minutes. The only thing you'll have to do is add your call sign, which gets programmed in the radio one time. You can turn on GPS, which most of the the current models of GPS of DStar radios have built-in GPS, and that's going to give your position. You can then go into the radio menu display and select the nearest repeater, and you're on the air. You're talking with no programming required, because there's a certain number of memories in the radio itself which have a database of repeaters. So you can just call up the nearest repeater from that database and you're on the air. Now, not every repeater is in there. There's not enough memory for that. So you can update your memories whenever it's convenient. And we'll talk just a little bit about that as well. The registration process.
And up there in Dawsonville. Sounding good, Jonathan.
I'll let Joe get that person muted.
Sorry,
Thanks.
go ahead.
All right, registration. Do you need to register your call sign to get on DStar? And the answer is no. But if you do register it, which is a simple process, it will allow you access to more functions on D+ repeaters and reflectors. Now, this next bullet might kind of throw you for a loop. Why do you need a DMR ID? And some of you who are in DMR know you go out and get an ID from sources as well. Some of the hotspots that are out there require you to put in a DMR ID. So you can go ahead and do that as well. But just to get on the air, you don't need that DMR ID going through a repeater. You have the option of registering either on your local repeater, or there's kind of a national site called regist.dstargateway.com. You'll see an example of the entry page over on the right side of the screen. Now, what you'll want to do, you want to register on one and only one system, because all the DStar repeaters and regist.dstargateway.com all sync together. So if you're registered on one, you're registered worldwide. The only time you would need to change that is if you change your call sign. Say, for example, you get a vanity call. Well, you can register with the new call sign on that. Registration is a three-step process. We've made it pretty simple. First, you'll go to, let's say, regist.dstargateway.org, and there you will enter some basic information. You will be, as a new user, you'll put in your name, your call sign, and your email address. Now, this part's been made easy because there's a team of system administrators that will verify your call and then approve your call sign. And you'll get an email back at the email address that you registered with and give you the instruction to do the final step, which is to add terminals. Very detailed process. We'll tell you how to do it. If you register, that allows you to do some functions like linking and unlinking your local repeater from reflectors, or it also allows you to use some of the hotspots that are out there as well. And we'll talk about hotspots. All right, I mentioned reflectors. Reflectors are like big conference bridges that are out there, and they link repeaters and hotspots together. So you can actually have, like we have in Georgia, reflector 030B, we affectionately call 30 Bravo, links all of the repeaters in Georgia, or at least one VHF or UHF repeater in each area, together to form a statewide network. And for ARES, AUXCOMM, emergency, special event use, this turns out to be very, very helpful. This was actually funded under a grant by GEMA back in 2009, and that's allowed us to create this statewide network, or the infrastructure behind it. You'll see a list here. I'm going to refer to this site quite often, dstarinfo.com. It's a wealth of information. And one of the things you'll have is a list of reflectors. So this list goes on. There's actually several hundred reflectors now, and each reflector has 2 or 3 modules within it. So that list gets multiplied by at least a factor of 3. But you can find a list of repeaters or reflectors, and it will tell you kind of where they are. Some of them are for, say, German language. One might be Italian, et cetera, et cetera. You'll find this list if you look at the Reflector tab you'll see here on dstarinfo.com. And most repeaters will link to Reflector by default to either become a part of a larger statewide or regional network, or they may just, there's a couple of reflectors out there I'll mention a little bit later as well, Reflector 1C and Reflector 30C. There you'll find hundreds of repeaters and hotspots all connected together in kind of a worldwide network that makes it a great place to go and have a QSO with someone, either locally or far away. All right, I'm going to spend a few minutes on these next few slides to show you an easy way to avoid having to do special programming on your radio. Now, I'm using the ICOM 51A as an example here, but the screens, whether it's a mobile from ICOM or the Kenwood D74, are going to look very similar to this. And the modes in DR mode make it very easy to do a quick selection of repeaters. And then you can also issue the linking commands without custom programming. Remember, I said earlier that you can get on the air very quickly because it has a database of repeaters already in the radio. In addition, you can put an SD card in it and store multiple configurations and multiple groups of repeaters and programming together. So the SD card is a part of just about every one of these radios. Now, to get started, you'll press on the ID51A, you want to get it into DR mode. So you'll see just below the blue button, there's this is like a four corners, like cursor keys. Press and hold the DR button, and it will come into this mode where you see to and from. And very basically, from selects the repeater that you want to use. And then the to setting up above that determines what you want to do with your signal, whether it be talk, link to a reflector, unlink, etc. So getting on the air very quickly, we're going to highlight the from setting and press the blue center button. That's going to give me the choice of doing nearest repeater or repeater list. Now, if I do a repeater list, I can select a repeater, either a DStar repeater, DV, or FM from a regional list. And yes, at least in the ICOM 51A, you can store both DStar and FM repeaters as well. Now I'm going to switch over to using nearest repeater. Well, let me see, let me go back. If I'm doing the repeater list, I would select that. I want to select the region of the country that I want to find a repeater in, and then I'm going to select a repeater. So it's going to give me a list, and I can scroll through that list using the top channel knob. And they're sorted by state, which you see right at the bottom of the display, and then within cities within that state. So here I've scrolled down the list, I'm into Georgia, and I've selected the Lawrenceville repeater, and it's going to give me the call sign and module of that repeater. Modules, B modules and C modules are what you'll find mostly around. C refers to a VHF or 2-meter repeater. B reflects a UHF or 70 centimeter repeater. So once I've selected the repeater that I want, I'm going to hit the blue, press the blue button, and that's going to select that particular repeater. Now that places that in the from setting. Now let's say I just want to get on the air quickly and I want to find the nearest repeater. So with the from highlighted, I press the center blue button to get to this screen, and I will select nearest repeater. And here you see I can select nearest repeater, whether it be DStar or FM or one or the other. If I want the nearest DStar repeater, I would select near repeater DV. Once I select that, then it's going to show me either if I've selected all, it's going to show me both nearest FM and DStar. If I select DV, only the DStar, or FM, show me only FM repeaters. And once I select that, it's going to give me a list of repeaters sorted by the distance to the repeater. since I did this right here near my house, Lawrenceville is going to come up first, followed by Stone Mountain, Buford, etc. And it will show you the distance to that repeater and the call sign of that repeater, and generally show the direction here as well. So you can select, you can scroll down the list or use the up, down, left, or right arrows, so to speak, to select that repeater, and then select it with the blue button, which is like an enter key. Now, we've selected the repeater. Now, what do we want to do? Now, I can scroll up using the top of the button here, and that will highlight 2. Now, that puts me at a point where I can now decide, what do I want to do? Most often, I just want to talk. So I want to select Reflector and then use Reflector. Now, this is very, very important. Out of the box, it will not be on use Reflector. It will just say CQ, CQ, CQ. Now, that's to talk locally on one repeater, the repeater that you're connected to. In 99.99% of the time, you're going to want to select use Reflector. And I'm going to go to the next, or go back a screen to see, then that's going to give you this display, use Reflector, CQ, CQ, CQ. A very common error that new DStar users will encounter. And you've probably heard this on the air. What happens is you're hearing one side of a conversation and you're not hearing the other. And what is happening there, both of those users are on the same repeater. One has his 2 set to use Reflector, CQ, CQ, CQ. The other has it to just local, or CQ, CQ, CQ. Now, what happens when you do that is the one that's on local, their voice does not go out of the local repeater to the reflector or whatever that repeater may be linked to. So you're only hearing the side of the conversation that the person has used Reflector, CQ, CQ, CQ. So that's a very common error, but this is the setting that you're going to want for 99% of the time, just to talk. Now, if you want to do something different, you can choose Link to Reflector, and that will allow you to select another reflector that you want to link to. You can choose Unlink Reflector, which, remember, if you're linked to a reflector, you need to unlink it first, then you can link to the new one. Now how do I do this? That's a common question. You're selecting the command that you want to send out, and then you key your microphone. So if I've selected Unlink Reflector, I will select that on the display, and I will press the push to talk, and it will send the command to unlink, and you'll hear the repeater announce that it is unlinked. Then you would go to Link to Reflector, and then it would give you a second screen, and you select which reflector you would like to go to. So you'll select 001 to, it could be all the way up to 999, and then you want to select A, B, or C. Usually that's going to be B for UHF, or no, excuse me, you're into a reflector, so it's just one of 3 modules, A, B, or C. So you can use the 4 corners of the display around the dual buttons, the blue button, to move it across to A or move it back to select the number. Now I'm going through this pretty quickly, but I hope you can pick up a little bit on this, and I'll give you a source that you can look at some videos. We'll explain this in a little bit more detail. All right, here's some simple rules for linking and unlinking. Let me mention first that most repeaters use some third-party software that was written by a gentleman in Birmingham, Alabama, and it's called Unlink. And what that software allows the repeater to do is to stay linked to a default reflector. And you'll see that most of the repeaters in Georgia stay by default linked to reflector 30 Bravo, 30B. Now, that doesn't mean you can't change that, because if you want to move it to another one, you would hit the unlink, again, select Unlink Reflector, key the mic, then you would go back to Link Reflector, select where you want to go, key the mic, and then you've got to remember, once you complete that and you're ready to talk, go back and select Use Reflector, and then you're able to talk. Now the repeater will echo back and tell you what it has done, either unlink or linked to a particular reflector. But remember, you're going to want to go back to Use Reflector. Otherwise, you're sending out that command to your local repeater every time. Now, you can update your repeater list, because whenever you bought your radio, it had a repeater list that was put into it, preloaded about the time that it was manufactured. And that list doesn't get updated very often. But fortunately, we've got a site that's based right here in Georgia called DStarInfo.com that allows you to update that and store that on your internal SD card. If we have time here before I finish up, I'll show you a quick glance at that website to see how it is. But basically, you're going to go in and put in your location, put in the model of your radio, and that determines how many memories that you have to load, and then it will create a CSV file, which you can then import into the radio. And that will then update your radio with the most current list centered around an area or a region of the country. So here's the process. You go to DStarInfo.com, go to Downloads. You'll put in your location. You can either put in a zip code, you can put in coordinates, you can put in a city, and it will look up that location. And then that determines, I want to find the repeaters centered around this point. You'll select your radio below, the model of the radio, and then that one will tell you how many memories that you have in the radio to be able to load. And then you will create a CSV file. Now, there's several sources of updated repeater data, but DStarInfo.com has one of the best resources for DStar repeaters in the country, actually in the world. Now, they also include FM repeater data, which you can load into your repeater list through an arrangement with repeaterbook.com. And then the RT System software, which is another company that manufactures some very, very good programming software, but it uses the DStarInfo.com data for the DStar repeaters as well. So a couple of resources there to be able to update your radio memories. Now, what about hotspots? These are some little devices that have come on the scene. Actually, some of the early ones were called a DV dongle and a DVAP. And there's, over the last few years, there's been several new ones that have been created that allow you to connect a radio to the DStar network via the internet. Let's say you're not in an area that either has weak coverage or no DStar repeater. This will allow you to use your handheld, your base radio, your mobile, whatever, by connecting your hotspot to the internet, and then it serves kind of like an access point does for Wi-Fi. You can then get on the air with that. Some of the newer ones include some models that are called DV Mega, the Zoom Spot, which I really like, Open Spot, which has come out with a brand new model, the Open Spot 3, which has a lot of features. But then you go back to the DVAP, which has been around for a number of years and performs that very basic function. What you'll do, you'll select an open frequency for the hotspot. They come in both VHF, UHF. A lot of people are using UHF because it's easier to find a clear frequency. You don't want to put it on a frequency with a repeater. Many are using just below 440 for UHF hotspots. I put mine just a little bit below that as well. Now, it's easiest to add a hotspot in DR mode using some of the empty programming slots that you can have. And that's an illustration of them below. If you, your list, which is your CSV file, if you left some blank spaces in it, you can go back and add some things. So for example, the first line, the top line, that's my DVAP. I can operate DV simplex. I've got a couple of other things programmed in there. And then that way I can select that in DR mode and use the to and from, just like I do to find a repeater. And that makes it easy to connect your hotspot to different reflectors. Now, an important thing about the current generation of hotspots is they'll do multiple digital modes, with most of them doing DStar, DMR, Fusion, and others. I've actually used on my Zoom spot, which is like the one you see in the case. I've used DStar, I've used DMR, Fusion, and P25 all through that hotspot. So because they use that same family of chips, the AMBE chips from DVSI, they now can support multiple modes. So these are a very handy addition to your shack or your Go box for field use. Let me see, I'm looking at a question here. I suspect a hotspot requires a radio with built-in digital mode. Yes, that is true. So if I want to operate DStar, I still need a DStar radio, or if I'm operating DMR, I need a DMR radio. Now, with many of the hotspots, they can connect to places where they are bridging between modes. So I may have a DMR radio and I'm connecting to a Fusion room. So you'll see some of that available to you as well. But yes, to answer the basic question, if I want to operate DStar, I need a DStar radio with my hotspot. Similarly for DMR, Fusion, etc. Good question. All right, let's go through a few tips and best practices, because we do have a lot of people that they've only been on DStar just a short time because of our COVID-19 Aries nets that are on. I think it's every other night now. We either have a DStar or an HF net. So with a lot of new folks coming in, here's some basic tips and best practices that I think you'll find useful. Remember I said set the to field to use reflector CQ, CQ, CQ. If it only says CQ, CQ, CQ without the use reflector, you're in local transmit and you're not going to leave your audio, your signal is not going to leave the local repeater. So you will not be heard on any of the linked repeaters. And that also goes for many of the hotspots. They require the use reflector CQ, CQ, CQ. Now, digital is going to be a little bit different. So please don't tailgate. And what I mean is leave some space in between transmissions. If your radio is real fast at switching from transmit to receive, you might even hear just a little bit of a blip of some voice. And that is your voice, because it takes a little bit of time to translate your voice from analog to digital and then back. So once you unkey, the repeater is still going to be transmitting for a few milliseconds to finish up all that data that you sent it in terms of your voice. So leave a little space in there and don't just jump right in, be real quick to key. Now here's something that if you're new to digital modes, you may not quite understand. There's two things that cause R2D2. And by R2D2, I mean that garbled, warbly, you're not reproducing the voice sound, but sounds just like the Star Wars character. Either low signal or packet loss. Now, in many cases, they're the same thing. If you have a low signal getting into the repeater, then the repeater is not going to receive your packets, your voice, faithfully, and therefore will drop some of the packets. And therefore, you are not faithfully reproducing your audio, and you get R2D2. Now, in some cases, you can have packet loss by itself, just packet loss. And that would be, you've got a hotspot, it's connected to the internet with your local internet connection, and you may have a slow or an intermittent internet connection, and that will cause loss of packets, and your voice will get interrupted. You'll have dropout. So if someone tells you, I've got R2D2, the chances are, if you're operating portable or mobile, your signal is weak. So just by retransmitting is not going to help that. You're going to need to move to make your signal a little stronger, increase your power, get to a better location. Just like on FM, moving 6 feet sometimes can make all the difference in the world. Another practice, if you've got hotspots, if you've got more than one hotspot, do not program them to use the same frequency. Here's what can happen. You have two hotspots. One's connected to one reflector, one's connected to another reflector. When you transmit, you're being heard by both of those hotspots and therefore going out on two different reflectors. You can also cause the two hotspots to link together, which would link two reflectors together. Not a good situation, can cause a lot of problems. So just remember, never have two hotspots, if you have two, on the same frequency. Now there's a term that you'll hear in DStar called quick key. For any of you that have joined us on the Southeast DStar WeatherNet, which most of the Georgia repeaters connect to a little bit before 9 p.m. each Sunday night, Net Control will say, I'll take Alabama stations or Florida stations or Georgia stations. Please quick key now. And what that means is you will just key your mic for about 1 second when the frequency is clear. You don't have to say anything, because remember, your call sign is being transmitted every time you key up. So net control stations may be using one of a couple of different ways to record or see all those call signs. So you don't have to check in and give your key up and give your call sign and say you're listening or checking in, whatever. You can just quick key. And some of the net controls on our DStar net for Aries has been using that one of those two software packages available. And they will, if they ask you to quick key, that means they can see your call sign. So just key your mic for 1 second. Don't send any voice, and unkey. They'll see a list of call signs. So that's what quick key means. That's something you can do with DStar because your call sign is transmitted. Now, another thing to remember during a net, don't key up unless you're asked to do so, because every time you do that, the net control station will see your call sign, and that person thinks you're wanting to break in. So just remember, don't key up. You wouldn't want to do that on FM net, but remember with DStar, you're sending your call sign out. Which also brings me to a point that I also say in a lot of my classes that I do. If you are a habitual kerchunker, you're not doing that anonymously anymore, because remember, every time you key, someone's going to see your call sign. They're going to know who you are. All right, another point to remember. The two busiest reflectors in the world are reflector 1C and reflector 30C. There's hundreds of people listening at any one point in time from around the world. So this is not the place to experiment or even maybe carry on a lengthy QSO. You can move off to another place if needed for that. There's plenty out there. So don't experiment. Think about others may be wanting to use that reflector, and just use some common courtesy there. Now, another thing on your local repeater, if a repeater is linked, which you've got to remember that most of them probably are by default, ask before unlinking or linking to another reflector. There may be someone listening, waiting for someone else to come in a different area. And if you just go in and unlink it without announcing your intention, that's pretty rude and not a good thing. Now, you don't have to remember if you've linked it somewhere else. You don't have to link it back to where it was. After a repeater has been linked, other than the default reflector, after it's idle for a period of time, you can come back and it will automatically link back to where it's supposed to be by default. So there's just a couple of things to keep in mind. And I'm going to end, and I guess we'll have time for a few questions. These are some great sites. Take these down. They're great resources, especially DStarInfo.com. lots and lots and lots of information, especially being able to update your memory downloads. There's some videos and past presentations. I've done a class for several years at Dayton Hamvention. Here we're doing about the 35-40 minute version of what I do for a 2-hour or 3-hour class. But you'll see some of those past presentations, PowerPoints and videos that you can bring down and learn more. DStarUsers.org. It's a great place, especially if you're building a new repeater list, last heard. DStar.info. There's some great repeater utilities. Call sign registration is actually housed there with info and status on all different repeaters, status around. So with that, I'm going to stop this, and I'm going to look for any question. Note that Peanut is available for those that do not have a digital capable radio. Ed, WA4YH, and myself have been working very closely, Ed lately, with the gentleman who developed Peanut. Peanut is an Android app that is available to you. And let me see where I can try to unshare my screen a little bit here. Go back to this. Peanut is an app that's available for Android. You can link to certain reflectors, kind of like EchoLink on the app, but 30 Bravo is one of those. So for Georgia, it's very handy that 30 Bravo is one of the choices, and that's an important point, Bobby, that it lets you get on without a DStar radio. Now, you can't do anything in linking and unlinking to other places or anything, but if you want to listen to the Georgia network, 30 Bravo is there for you. Let me see, another question for the few that have DStar HF, like the AUXCOMM 7100, what frequencies would I hear DStar HF on? I'm going to go back here to the DStar site, and I'm going to share my screen again. I want to show you this tab, make sure that comes up. If I look at nets and I come down here to DStar HF net, you will find information. There's some regular DStar nets. And with the new AUXCOMM 9700 radio, they're even doing pictures that are able to be transmitted over HF as well. So the DStar International HF Testing Net, it's on during the week, a few nights. They go through all the different frequencies, so it's kind of interesting to see operating on HF, how far you can get with the digital signal. And it's always amazing that you're listening to a station halfway across the country or on the West Coast or whatever, and they sound just like coming out of your HT, someone simplex right next to you. Joe asked, are there any DStar simplex nets or promotions for simplex? Not sure what that means. DStar simplex nets. I'm not aware of any, but always keep in mind that you can talk simplex between two radios on DStar, just like you can on, I wouldn't, well, let me see, if there's two of you and you're wanting to get on 5.2 or something like that, yeah, that's fine. You're on two handhelds or something. Not aware of any set frequencies for that. Joe also pointed out, thanks Joe, that there is a Windows program for Peanuts that you can download as well. So use your computer and your sound card for that as well. Any other questions? Well, Joe, with that, I'll turn it back over to you and we'll go to the next part of our meeting tonight.
That's an awesome presentation. Awesome presentation. Thank you very much, John. All right, at this point, we're going to pause so I can stop the recording.